27 years after a whole fifth-grade class vanished on a school trip, one mother, Laura Calloway, still mourns her lost daughter Rory. On the anniversary, while looking through old photos, she notices the school principal, Lillian Brooks, appears in a class picture that had been believed to show only the teacher and a support staff. A chance visit to the principal's house, a late afternoon sighting in the cemetery, and a confrontation with a frightened young woman reveal that one of the children, Audrey Whitman, survived and has been living in secret. Audrey confesses she was rescued and hidden with the principal's help, revealing a human trafficking ring that took the children overseas. The principal is arrested after Audrey's testimony, the cold case reopens, and the families finally get painful answers and a path toward justice and healing. The town marked the anniversary quietly, as if hushed by an unspoken vow. Dawn came like a pale apology, a thin ribbon of gray light over neat lawns and faded schoolyard lines. Laura Calloway moved through her mourning with the exact motions grief had carved into her life. Kettle on, bathroom mirror, the small framed photo pinned at her dressing table. Rory's smile held the same tilt it had that last morning, one of those careless, morning-in-the-house grins that never imagined vanishing. Laura pressed her thumb to the photo edge until the paper reached warmth. The date, September 28th, sat like a notch on an old clock, each year another turn around a hollow center. When she left the house, the sky threatened rain with an impatience that matched her own. Helen's porch light blinked as she walked up. The years had softened Helen into permanence, someone who'd learned to hold grief like a shared cup. Inside Helen's living room, the tea smelled like an ordinary kindness, bergamot and lavender bruised by steam. Albums lay open between them, a small constellation of captured time. They did not speak in big sentences. They traded fragments. Rory's first day, a crooked helium balloon, the tiny freckle near her lip. Memory fit itself around the edges of those images like water into stone. Then a photograph, one Helen had retrieved from the police archive months before, took the breath from Laura like ice. It was a school group, children clustered by a yellow bus, lab coats and science fair glue still in their hair. Laughter trapped in a gelatinous second. Laura's eyes moved from familiar faces to an unfamiliar anchor, Principal Lillian Brooks, standing at the bus's flank. It was an image of ordinary proximity. But their accepted story had always been clean. Mr. Gregory, the teacher, and one support staff took the class. Not the principal. Helen had her own scars. "They let us have the files," she said quietly. "Just the paper, no answers. We asked for anything that might have been missed." Her fingers found Laura's hand across the album, returning the touch that had been there through hearings and funerals. Laura's chest remembered a different conversation, years of police saying, "we think," and it's inconclusive. A photograph was not evidence, but it was a fissure. Outside, the sky leaked into gutters. The kettle's final shriek was soft, almost apologetic. For the first time since the case went cold, Laura felt a ripple of something that wasn't only grief, something closer to a thread she could pull. She wrapped the photograph in the heel of her palm as if it were a fragile bone and left Helen's house with the bus image tucked under her arm. She walked the streets that had not forgotten her, tracing the route she'd once taken with Rory clinging to a small, sticky hand. The bus stop smelled of diesel and wet leaves. Memories arrived in precise flashes. The school's uniform colors, the bus's dented side, Mr. Gregory checking a manifest. The picture did what photographs do. It made time tangible, and there, in the hard gloss of the image, Laura found a new question that would not be soothed by ritual or tea. The rain started as she crossed the road, thin, urgent. The photograph was now a compass, and she could not ignore its pull. There was a house near the route, a house she had walked past 1,000 times, where the principal had once been an authority figure, and then a figure who abdicated answers. Laura's breath hitched beneath the collar of her coat as she lifted her hand to knock. The town watched without sentiment because it had been watching for 27 years, while Laura took a step toward something she had no right to hope for and everything to lose. The porch was narrower than she remembered. Hydrangeas framed the steps and a brass bell, dulled by years of touch, chimed when the door opened. Lillian Brooks, less the principal now than a woman who had learned to hold the gravity of other people's tragedies, answered with a practiced gentleness. Time had lined her face, but not the armor in her voice. She offered a smile like a curtain she could drop at will. Laura kept the photograph visible as she spoke. "I found this," she said, as if presenting a relic, "and I can't reconcile it with what I was told." The principal's hand fluttered to the picture without touching it, eyes narrowing as if rereading a line of handwriting. "Oh, that," Lillian murmured. "It was taken before the trip on school grounds. I didn't go." Her words were immediate, almost rehearsed. Laura watched the micro-movements, a tightened jaw, the way the principal glanced past her threshold, like someone checking for an audience. The explanation should have landed and closed like a door. Instead, it bracketed the problem. The photograph's small anomalies, Lillian's color, the bus driver's cap, a faint smudge on the bus window, began to orbit in Laura's mind. Why had some parents remembered seeing Lillian at the farewells? Why had stories diverged and then calcified into facts that fit the easiest narrative? Laura left with a paper-thin apology and the same old friction in her chest, not proof, only insistence. At the florist, she arranged ritual into neat stems. Roses for memory. Lavender for sleep. The florist's hand, Sarah's, moved as if this were a familiar choreography. Grief has its own repetitive gestures. Helen and Matthew arrived. Small talk folded into condolences, the way people who have lost a thing share a shorthand that sidesteps the larger truth. Laura almost told them everything on the spot. Almost. Instead, she wrapped the bouquet and put the photograph back into her pocket, as if keeping a secret warm. The bus ride to the cemetery became a study in detachment and movement. Rain-blurred window frames into watercolor streaks. Laura imagined the photograph being examined under different light, digital scans, enhanced contrast, metadata that could place it by time of day. The details multiplied into hypotheses. Maybe the photograph had been taken at 2 points on the same day. Maybe an extra staff member had shown up. Maybe memory itself had betrayed them when they needed it least. The questions had the smell of all the other leads that went nowhere, but they also had a stubborn, unwieldy weight. At the graveside, familiar names carved into granite felt both a solace and a lie. The stones were placeholders, not proof. Laura knelt and arranged flowers with slow, importunate care. She read pieces of a life back into space, a joke Rory liked, a melody she hummed. When Laura straightened, she noticed the young woman standing apart, leaning on the low stone wall, shoulders bowed, eyes fixed on a single patch of earth. There was a photograph beside her, propped like a message. Something in the way she avoided the direct sun, in the small tremor of her hands, told Laura that grief pulsed in her like a private fever. Laura approached with the awkward politeness that years of shared sorrow cultivate. "Do you come here often?" she asked, and it sounded suddenly naive. The woman started, blinked, then murmured that she came every year, later than the families, in the quiet hour. Her name came out eventually, softly, Audrey Whitman. The name collided in Laura's mouth with the countless times it had been said at vigils, at the courthouse, in headlines. Audrey looked younger than the name suggested. There was a hollow in her gaze that made Laura's breath catch. The corner of the photograph in Laura's pocket felt heavier. When she offered the bus image, Audrey's reaction was not merely recognition. It was a small, visceral recoil. Her hand closed around the photo as if it were both accusation and proof. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. Laura, who had rehearsed questions for 27 years, felt all of them crumble. The conversation that followed would not be a tidy exchange of facts. It would be a negotiation with pain and the politics of silence. But for the first time in a long time, an unscripted fracture opened between what people had been told and what might, very quietly, be true. Audrey's voice arrived like a small avalanche, hesitant at first, then rolling. She did not want to speak. She had rehearsed hiding many times in her head, but the photograph seemed to undo a restraint she'd maintained for decades. "I was on that bus," she said. The cemetery air narrowed. Laura's fingers tightened on the wrapped stems until the ribbon creased. The story she offered was not cinematic in the quickness of its beats. It was granular and ragged, memory splayed into fragments, a late transfer across a state line, the blur of different languages, hands that smelled of diesel and something metallic. Audrey described escape, not rescue, a night when an opportunity, chaos, at a holding site opened and she ran. She crossed fields and highways, found a bus depot, and in a city where no one knew her name, she began to stitch herself into invisibility. Trauma had shaped who she became. The principal's name came out only as a tether. Lillian Brooks found her after she ran, pulled her from a dizzying limbo, provided an apartment, money, the trappings of a life that did not ask questions. She said the police would ruin everything, Audrey whispered, palms white around the photograph. She said the families would break again, that the traffickers might find me, and that silence was safety. There was a moral logic to it in Lillian's voice, the kind built from pressure and fear, from the cornering of a community leader who was suddenly small. Laura felt the shift in the air like an electric current. The neat villain counterpoint she had carried, teacher, disappear, guilt, dissolved into a more complex architecture, a principal who had been both protector and gatekeeper, traffickers with reach, and a survivor too fragile to be a witness. The photograph, it turned out, had not been an accident but a kind of breadcrumb. Audrey admitted she had been given the photo once, told to keep a low profile, and instructed to remember only fragments that could not be corroborated. The midpoint revealed a terrifying calculus, secrecy as a bargaining chip. Lillian's recorded care for Audrey changed into coercion when Laura realized how easily influence could morph into containment. Audrey's silence had been bought with kindness, but that kindness had become a chain, a muted complicity that kept a city from confronting a nightmare. Laura's resolve hardened. If Audrey would testify, even now, it might crack the case open, but convincing a woman who had been taught to equate survival with silence would require more than moral outrage. They needed proof. Memory alone would not shift the legal machinery. Audrey's recollection of the trafficker's accents, a spoken phrase from the holding site, a small token she remembered, these would become anchors to build a case. The potential for international collaboration rose like a map: border crossings, false manifests, shipments with blank paperwork. In the interrogation of quieter details, detectives might trace the path. Audrey's acceptance that she could speak was not sudden. It had been negotiated in private nightmares for years. Yet here, on a damp slope between headstones, she made a choice toward voice. The siren was a distant sound then, not yet close enough to promise rescue. But the truth had finally been named in public space, and naming itself changed the geometry of fear. Laura understood, in that halted moment, that the story now had an axis, not only the missing children, but the fragile, living witness who carried the map in her memory. The midpoint twist was not merely a revelation about survival, it reoriented the story around obligation and consequence, who benefits from hiding a truth, and who pays when the ledger is finally balanced. The case was no longer a static wound. It was a movable thing, and Laura would have to navigate the terrain of guilt, leverage, and redemption to pry it open. Back at the station, the fluorescent light hummed like a nervous insect. Officer Jensen, whose face was remembered from old case files and courtroom benches, stopped revising his skepticism the moment Audrey named names and places with enough tangibility to snag his attention. He asked for specifics. Years of losing the exactitudes of time had blurred some details, but Audrey offered fragments that could be cross-referenced. A freight manifest number scribbled on a torn receipt she had stashed in a shoe. A phrase in Spanish shouted by a trader that matched a recorded call in an old police file. A nickname for a holding site on the border town that matched a journalist's buried report. Investigators pivoted. Units were dispatched to digital archives, to shipping manifests, to closed accounts. The police station turned into an engine of sudden motion: phones, printers, steady footsteps. Lillian Brooks, summoned under the weight of Audrey's declaration, arrived in a manner that suggested inevitability rather than surprise. Her face had the pale composure of someone who had rehearsed answers for worse possibilities. For the community, the arrest was a thunderclap. The woman who had lectured PTA meeting after PTA meeting, who signed off on school trips with a pen that had a faint blue scar. She was now at the center of an accusation, so wide it threatened to swallow an entire town's quiet. Laura watched Lillian through the glass of the observation room. When the principal spoke, her voice sometimes broke once, twice, on the question of motive. She had had debts, she said. There had been threats to her family from loan sharks who wanted quick payment and had threatened to take everything: reputation, property, safety. She had panicked and made a decision she framed as an act of protection: divert risk away from the school, away from other families. The confession came in slow, knotted sentences that alternately sought forgiveness and struck at the enormity of what she had done. The investigators peeled each claim like an onion. They matched the principal's phone records against nights a bus had been tampered with, compared financial transfers to suspicious accounts, and pulled surveillance footage from a service station near the staging area where, decades ago, the bus had last been seen. Slowly, connective tissue materialized. The logistics of a sabotage, a transfer, a smuggling route, something that had been felt in the gut and labeled improbable years ago, now took shape in documents. Audrey's participation in the legal process was delicate. She needed protection, but she also wanted agency. Witness protection was not only a protocol, it was an ethical lifeline. The police offered it with the sterile courtesy of officers used to administering difficult choices: anonymity, relocation, new identity if she cooperated. Audrey's gratitude was jagged. She had been coached in silence. Now the coaching was toward testimony and the brittle hope of justice. As more pieces fell into place, bank transfers leading to anonymous accounts, a shipping manifest that flagged a route across the border that matched Audrey's fragmentary memory, the scale of betrayal widened. It was not simply a failed trip. The town's trust had been traded for a survival strategy that entangled predators and institutions. The photographs that had once been purely relics were now evidence: angles, timestamps, people who had been in the wrong place and the wrong time. Laura's earlier cautions became fuel. She handed over names, dates, memories she had cataloged in a grief that had made her an archivist of loss. The pressure mounted. Rumors swirled in town, some supportive, some acid-tongued. But the legal gears do not move on gossip alone. They move on proof. Police liaison teams coordinated with contact points across borders. A quiet team of prosecutors mapped possible extradition pathways and evidence chains. The narrative that had been contained to evening whispers now stretched toward an international inquiry, toward a humiliating exposure of networks that trafficked in children. Before the climax, there was another rupture. A recorded confession from Lillian surfaced in the investigation files, a moment previously hidden in an older police transcript where she had equivocated about helping a child. It suggested more than a protective measure, it implied orchestration. The town that had sat on the story, tired and half-forgotten, braced for what would come next. For Laura, the edges of grief sharpened into a purpose she'd not felt since Rory first walked into school: to demand a truth that could not be papered over by professional apologies. The interrogation room smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper. Lillian Brooks, at once diminished and defiant, faced the circle of questions with a gravity that had once given her the air of authority. Her confession did not arrive as a cinematic collapse. It came in the careful, legal language of someone who had decided there was no longer a way to keep the ledger balanced. She told of debts that calcified into fear, of meetings that spiraled, of promises she had made to men who counted value in silence. She had organized the route, she admitted, ensuring a transfer that removed the class from local sight. She had pointed fingers at Mr. Gregory to blunt suspicion. It felt like a confession that was both mechanical and human, one that translated into legal jeopardy and moral ruin. Audrey sat on the other side of the glass, each of her breaths a small victory. She mapped what she remembered for the investigators, the names they used, the times of movement, the one image she had never forgotten: the bus's dented door, a lanyard with a logo that didn't belong. Her memories fit like puzzle pieces into the newly assembled framework. Her testimony reframed the decades of ambiguous leads into a coherent, if harrowing, chronology. The fact that a survivor now spoke crystallized what suspicion had only hinted at. When the prosecutor read back the timeline, the room seemed to lean together. The bus had been sabotaged at a remote rest stop, the driver incapacitated, the teacher and children rerouted. The trail led south, across borders, into a trafficking network that specialized in moving children into exploitative labor and, in documented cases, to violent ends. Evidence, bank records, shipping logs, and corroboration from a border informant matched Audrey's recollections. The courtroom pleads and police proceduralisms reduced into an excruciating, devastating clarity, Many of the children had not simply been missing, they had been taken into systems designed to erase them. Then the unbearable, Audrey's voice, raw but steady, said the names no one had wanted to say aloud. She described nights of captivity and a day when Rory had been given something that did not agree with her small body. Laura felt the world tilt. The precise cruelty of the trafficking, the casualness of death in that other place, these were not cinematic horrors designed for shock. They were the blunt, ordinary mechanics of exploitation. The officers' faces did not change. They had dealt with horrors before, but the parents' faces did. Anguish and rage arranged themselves on those faces into a new geometry. The legal machine kicked into higher gears. Warrants flew to foreign jurisdictions. Interpol-style liaisons were engaged. The town, which had learned to guard itself from the tsunami of grief, now had to focus anger into legal remedies that could pursue distant criminals and the local enablers who had paved their path. Lillian's role was no longer one of ambiguous culpability. It had become central to a conspiracy to expose children to harm for reasons rooted in desperation and moral failure. In the immediate aftermath of the confession, there was a moment of impossible stillness. Laura could feel the years of ritualized mourning, birthdays, anniversaries, the small daily practices compress into a single heavy point. The knowledge of what had happened to Rory did not undo grief. It redirected it. Closure was not a soft blanket, but a new jagged tool. There would be trials, appeals, diplomatic friction. There would be the long slog of international cooperation to locate remains and bring perpetrators to account. And yet, a terrible relief passed through Laura like a current. The story was no longer suspended in the grotesque space between not knowing and wild speculation. Audrey's decision to speak had detonated the stasis. For Laura, the climax was not vindictive triumph. It was a complex alchemy of sorrow, justice, and the very human need to name what happened so that it might not be repeated. In the charged quiet after Lillian's confession, mothers wept without shame and families began to re-envision how to channel the newly found facts into action. The law would take its turns. Laura, for the first time since the disappearance, felt anchored to a purpose that exceeded mourning. She would be a witness to truth, a steward of the children's memory that demanded the world respond. Evenings in town resumed a false normal that never quite hid the morning's rupture. The news cycles rolled with cautious phrasing and legal caveats. Detectives flew, subpoenas moved through bureaucratic teeth, and international partners began tracing a chain of transactions that stretched across borders. The legal path would be long and uncertain. Some leads would wither, some perpetrators would vanish into shadow. But something irreversible had happened. The wound had a name now, and names carry consequences. For Laura, the aftermath was a slow rearrangement rather than a resolution. She sat at Rory's grave again, the stone cool beneath her palm. The bouquet lay like a small, defiant promise. There were things a date could not alter. The childhood Rory never lived, birthdays unspent, places at tables forever empty. But the knowledge, awful as it was, had transformed helplessness into direction. Laura met with prosecutors, read through witness statements, and, between sessions, she and Helen organized support groups for families who had learned the truth the hard way. They became less a pair of mourning women than an axis of advocacy. Audrey, after her testimony, entered protective custody and began a fragile process of reclamation. The community balked at the idea that the principal who'd once been the face of the school's values had kept a survivor hidden, but Audrey's survival complicated moral categories. She had been a child once, then prey, then, in the principal's strange calculus, a project of containment. The community had to hold many contradictory feelings at once: gratitude that one of the missing had survived, anger that any adult could have chosen silence over seeking justice. The first trial date was set, and the town braced for a public excavation of private failures. Lillian Brooks faced not only criminal charges, but the public accounting of choices made under pressure. She pleaded, at times, for understanding that had hollowed power into cowardice. Families, for their part, demanded truth and repair. Fundraisers and vigils turned into formal advocacy, campaigns to strengthen oversight of school trip protocols, to tighten financial transparency in district payroll, and to fund specialized support for trafficking survivors. Laura found, In the wake, a new rhythm. She could not unmake the past, but she could shape the future. She met with NGOs working on cross-border trafficking and learned to translate her grief into procedural pressure, petitions, policy briefs, legislative outreach. She taught workshops that trained volunteers to identify exploitation. She testified before panels. These were not noble acts that repaired a life, but they were stitches over an exposed wound. There were quieter, private reckonings as well. Helen and Laura sat at kitchen tables with letters from families across the country who found courage in Audrey's story to speak. Some of the letters thanked them for breaking silence. Others demanded accountability for failures still hidden. Laura wrote replies that were both practical and raw: resources, lawyers, and a steady insistence. You are not alone. On a late autumn evening, Laura stood at the edge of the schoolyard watching children practice a play. Their laughter, fractured and bright, rippled across the grass. She felt a tender, almost unbearable love and the steady thrum of responsibility. She remembered Rory in motion, a small, luminous presence who had been, for a span, very much present. The grief did not lift. Instead, it moved into a new shape that included action. The final image is not tidy. It is a hand laying a small, neat bouquet on a stone and then rising, slow, deliberate, toward a horizon of work. There would be trials and appeals, lost leads, and bureaucratic frustration. Some families would find remains, some answers would remain partial. But Audrey's voice had pried open a door that no one could close again. For Laura, closure was not a cinematic reveal, but the daily work of honoring memory by refusing silence. She had been given what she had always wanted most: the truth. Its weight was heavy and righteous, and she would carry it forward, step by painstaking step, until the trace of those children could be set properly in light.